I'm going to talk to you about the psychology of shopping. Now, the problem with the psychology of shopping is that there is so much to be said about it. There is just an endless amount, and we could, in theory, spend, I don't know, the next 3 years here talk about it. So that means that what you're hearing today is not everything that you could possibly imagine that incorporates the psychology of shopping. So just bear that in mind. So should you have any questions specifically, perhaps that you want me to address, you can, maybe raise your hand or even wait until the end and then just ask me, because it's very likely I won't cover everything you will want to know. So I'm happy with questions outside of the talk as well, which is worth noting, I think. And bearing in mind that we are talking about such a vast area, we are going to give you, or I'm going to give you rather, a bit of a snapshot of all the different areas that I think are potentially quite interesting. And we're going to talk about society and its influences, because people often think, oh, we just do what we do for no good reason. And there's a lot more to it. It's much more ingrained in society than we often realize. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. And then we're going to talk about how consumers think, because we always seem to work on the assumption that we know how we think, and therefore we will do whatever we think we are doing, when actually often people think in a totally different way to what they believe, and they often do the opposite to what they in fact believe. Not to confuse you too much, I will explain this as we go along. And then we're going to talk a little bit about restaurants, and then supermarkets, and then we're going to talk a little bit about online shopping, which people tend to be very interested in now. I remember the good old days when no one shopped online. It was a lot easier because my talks were more condensed. Now they're just going on and on and on and on. So that's what we're going to talk about. But we're going to start talking about society. So here's the problem. If we were to measure consumers today on how materialistic they are, we will find that about 95% of the population falls above what used to be the mean, i.e. you were neither materialistic or you were materialistic about 15, 20 years ago. It's been on a steady rise that people are becoming materialistic for the last 30 or so years, really starting with the Ford model that Henry Ford, when he sort of constructed the assembly line during the 1950s, that was sort of the onset, and ever since mass production, we've seen a huge increase. Of course, the reality is that we want people to consume, especially in the westernized world, because it's good for the economy. So one thing that's hugely influential on what people do, and have been for a long time, is what politicians actually say. We don't hear them, and we pretend we don't like them. We also pretend we don't care. But the reality is, if you hear something enough times globally, it starts influencing you subconsciously. So the one thing that I absolutely love, now if anybody feels they know their history a bit, you might know that Winston Churchill was particularly a fan of cigars. But his second love, or so they say, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a historian, was that he really loved champagne. The one thing that I do know for a fact is that when they had a big cabinet meeting and they were talking about helping France out, he sort of did say to the people, well, gentlemen, hang on a minute, you need to remember, we're not fighting for France, we're actually fighting for champagne. So those kind of symbolic statements really kind of get ingrained into society. I'm not talking about a one-off comment here. There's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these through the years. And if you actually ever go online and you Google something like politicians and statements in reference to consumption, you will find it's an endless amount. So they've always very much encouraged us. And another very nice example of this is when the World Trade Center was attacked a while back, and George Bush really didn't know what to say or do. And he was sort of starting in a lot of his talks about talking about we need to get the economy sort of working again. This is very important. And then he came out with statements, usually followed by these sort of ideas, that actually Americans need to do the things that are really genuinely American. Go to Disney World and have a nice time. Go and eat burgers. I remember at the time I was thinking, I mean, I, like most people, don't particularly like politicians. No offense if anybody is one in here. But I was always a little bit going, oh, hang on, he's saying this again, go off and buy something, because that's what he wanted people to do. So we hear this, the society is hugely influential. And then, of course, it's closer proximity to ourselves as well. It's not just society from a top-down level, but it's also very much, what do people around us do? So even if you're not listening to all the messages coming out of everywhere, you're probably observing what other people do. And the fact is, the more of a consumer society people live in, the more likely they are to consume far more than they actually need. So that's the first point I want to make. So now we're going to move on a little bit and just talk about the way we're thinking. Because we are incredibly complicated. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. But we're also, because we are so complicated and because we get cognitively tired, we tend to fall into little traps in terms of how we're thinking and what influences our thinking. And that potentially, as consumers, makes us quite vulnerable and a marketeer's dream, because we can actually do things to change not only your behavior, but also how you're thinking about things and where you're walking and all sorts of interesting things. Now, the thing is, these kind of influences are usually unconscious, so you're not aware of them. You're not aware of thinking or acting on any of the things that I'm going to demonstrate to you today. So if you go, oh, I don't do that, just take a step back and stop yourself, and next time you're doing something, ask somebody else to observe you. So very famously now, we know sustainability is a hot topic in consumption. That's something like 75% of the average consumer, when they canvass, they say they're actually really trying very hard to purchase sustainable goods and products. If that was true, then we wouldn't actually have such high sales of the things that are not sustainable. And actually, most people would only be consuming environmentally friendly goods. That's not the reality, because we can go into any kind of shop and see that doesn't hold up. So again, what people say is very different from what they do, and this is because we're acting subconsciously a lot of the time. One thing that guides our behavior is price. Now, we are all very excitable by price, and this is basically because we've been primed to think that something that is a good value is something that's going to benefit you. So we kind of conditioned into thinking this. And interestingly enough, when we actually do fMRI scans on consumers and we're presenting them with what people perceive to be really good bargains, the same part of our brain which is activated when we experience pleasure is activated. Again, you don't know this, it just kind of happens. So it gives you a little bit of an adrenaline rush, and this is why it's so difficult for people to resist bargains. You know, think going down the supermarket, 2-for-1 offer, that sort of thing, and you think, oh, I've got to have this. And you don't even know you're thinking that, because it's just kind of an impulse almost that's taking you up to grab those two things, even though you probably didn't want them in the first place. And when we think price is unfair, remarkably, the same part of our brain, which is activated when we experience pain, is actually triggered. So again, it means we're very, very sensitive to price more broadly. And we really need to get in tune with that, because the one thing, if you put it to the forefront of your mind when you do any kind of shopping, you can control that and actually think, I'm not going to be swept away by this and go crazy and do some impulse shopping. But if you don't think about it, you will be persuaded subconsciously. Now, the kind of way in which things are phrased is also something that we tend to fall prey to. And it's very difficult for consumers every time they see a message to think, is this feasible? Is it not? Should I be worried about this? Should I not? You don't really want to do that because you will become too tired. And we have a lot of other problems in life apart from shopping. You know, it might be the partner or the kids or the grandma or the phone's ringing or, you know, what are we going to make for tea tonight? There's so much going on in people's mind that if they're presented with the right kind of message, you will act on it. So if we presented you with this, pardon if you're a vegetarian, but this is actually from a genuine study, which is why it's the example on the screen. And you have a message over beef. One says it's 75% lean, and the other one says it's 25% fat. They pretty much look identical. Which one would you pick? The lean one. Yes, of course you would pick the lean one. So you imagine you're out shopping in a supermarket or something, and you see something which is a big figure compared to another figure with a positive message, i.e. lean, because we don't really want a bit of beef to be full of fat. I mean, that's not terribly appealing. You would automatically grab that one. So we know that the way in which information is presented would very much mold the way you're actually looking at things and what you are more likely to pick. So we can really influence you looking at that. And this framing effect, as we're referring to, comes through very strongly in all sorts of situations. It works better with numbers, but it can also work on pictorial stimuli. But another quite nice example is if you're presenting, if anybody plays golf, you probably know that often there are different types of prices for different types of memberships, a bit like gyms, effectively. And if you are presenting something like, you know, it's fair to charge a regular price for early tea times and 20% off for later tea times, people go, But if you're saying unfair, that you're charging a 20% to the price of the early tea times, you know, people going, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense. You are getting the same sort of message, but they have a preference for one over the other because they see it as being unfair. So taking things away is acceptable, but adding things on is not acceptable. Again, it's to kind of do with our automatic response in our brain where we're thinking we want a fair price, and adding to the slot, which is more kind of prime, seems unfair. But taking something off, the one that isn't, that's kind of okay. So we know that this works really well. We can also use a similar kind of framing effect. For those of you that shop online, this is just one example. We're going to go through more online stuff in a bit. But something that commonly occurs on websites is things like, there's only one left, get going, or you're going to lose it out. And this is, of course, to do with the fear of missing out. So we kind of have the framing of one left. But of course, you could probably go to another 20 different websites that have a similar kind of setup to this one, whereby they will have additional rooms left. They may not, but you know, they could. So they're trying to get you to have this sort of rush that you might be missing out. And if this was judged as a fair price, then that's going to be accelerated and you will almost guaranteed click on it and go, right, I'm going to purchase this one here and now because I'm so worried that somebody else will get it before me. There's a lot of these kind of, it's the last one, or there's a limited number, or whatever it is they say, but it has the same sort of impact on people's responses to what they're doing. So, restaurants, we all like going there, don't we? No? Well, some people are nodding, some are going, no, not really. Smelly places, we're not doing that. Well, I am a huge fan of restaurants. I can sit and stare at people for hours. So if you ever see me in there and I'm looking particularly suspicious, it's probably because I'm there just to observe. But menus are a big thing, because again, we talked about numbers and how we can kind of get people to respond. And most menus in restaurants are using what we refer to as anchoring and adjustment. And this is a bit of a crazy thing, because we know, and this comes from Nobel Prize winners in 2002, Kahneman and Tversky, so we know it's very tested in economics. If you give someone a number, they will use it as the base for comparison, basically. So that's the anchor, and then your comparison is the adjustment that's going on. And as an example, because people will say, oh, but if we're aware of this, if we're good at it, it's not going to work. But they did a nice study a few years ago on a bunch of estate agents, and they basically said to people, here, have a look at this list. And these are the prices of the houses, or what we think they should be evaluated at. And now go off, have a look at the house, and come back and give us what you think it's worth. And they found when they did this, even though it's their profession and they're very much in tune with the value of the houses, they actually had adjusted it accordingly to the lists that they saw. So we know that we do this all the time, and people who are particularly keen on using this are sort of people who come to your doorstep and try to sell you things. Charities, I don't want to pick on them because I'm a huge fan of charities. I think they do a great job, but they do have sneaky strategies. They will say, oh, you know, they will start off talking by 1 million people are starving, and then they'll ask for £2. In your mind, you're still thinking about the 1 million people starving, which means the £2 seems so small that it doesn't matter if you give them £2. And then, of course, that leads often to a foot in the door technique, so they can come back and then they can up the number, because once they've got that kind of commitment out of you, as consumers, we tend to think, oh, a little increase, it's okay because I already committed to this course, which is why it can be difficult for charities to get people to switch the donations they're actually making. So back to the restaurants, because I'm sidetracking a bit. You need to keep me on track and tell me when I do that, because I talk a lot and I get carried away. But here's the thing. This is actually an example of a real menu. It's a chain of restaurants. They have one in London as well. And what they've done there, because on menus, we know from eye tracking data, the most likely spot people look at first on a menu is the top right-hand corner. That's just the way it is. And on here, we got 2 sort of set type menus, and they are not the cheapest, okay? And that's deliberate. So that's so that you look there, get a high number, which is your anchor, and then anything else you look at the menu will seem really cheap. And therefore, you're not going to grumble over the prices. So it's quite clever. And another area they are very keen on doing this is wine lists. I actually had a bit of a laugh recently because I went to a pizza place with a friend, and she looked at the wine menu and she went, oh my goodness, that's ridiculous. Why would they charge £200 in a place like this? And I was just thinking, yeah. And then I thought, do I really launch into this explanation, or do I leave it for now? You know, friends out for a pizza, not the talking shop might not be so much fun. But of course, this is exactly what they're doing. So they will put a really high value on something. They're not expecting people to buy it. But when you then look at the cheaper values, all of a sudden, 50 quid doesn't seem so bad for a sparkling bottle of wine. It's fine, because it's not as expensive as the really high one. And often, again, when they just have lists, not just for wine, but also for food, they often start off with something that is very cheap. People never want to pick the cheapest ones. And then middle wine range or price range of menus. And then at the bottom, there'll be something ridiculous again. And that almost guarantees that people will go in the middle section, because they think the cheapest is never going to be as good. They're out to treat themselves. But clearly, you know, the 300 quid at the bottom seems a bit steep, so I'll go for the 50. When actually, probably, if you'd had your senses with wits with you, you would have paid 25, but there we go. Other little tricks that happens in kind of food-related outlets is very simple things, like change the color of the coffee cup you're serving in. And color is very influential, especially when it comes to foods. So we also know that we can get people to eat more or eat less, in fact, if that's what you want. It's not usually what you want, but you can change people's eating behaviors. And equally, if you have a dark-looking coffee cup, you will actually say it has more body. It's richer in sort of as a textured type coffee, which is remarkable, and that's just from switching the colors of the actual cups. And we see that a lot within foods. There's so many tricks. Again, we won't have time to do this, but you can have different types of names of things and people respond differently to it. The shapes of the glasses, whether you can hear the sound from the drinks when they're pouring them, all those kind of things will change your perception in a restaurant. So it's really quite interesting how we can do that. But also something that comes through is the sort of textures of things. So food is particularly important, not just from the way it feels when we're actually eating, because of course that influences. You want something to perhaps be very crunchy if it's a biscuit, because if it's not crunchy, you're thinking, oh, this isn't quite aligned with my expectations. So we're very much in tune with the textures of things. And we also know, I don't know if you know who Heston Blumenthal is, but he's had quite a lot of interesting ideas going on in his food outlets, in the sense that he's really changed textures. But now it seems to have become a thing, so people don't respond negatively because they go in with those expectations. But if you don't, you will be very strongly influenced by whatever it is you're coming across. And those textures are also important visually. So what we did in a study, which is a few years ago now, is we just gave people an option of looking at 6 different biscuits in real life. They all smell the same. They pretty much look the same. And we found that when you got quite strong-looking textures, like the ones at the bottom, people don't think very much of it. And it seemed to be that it's almost aligned with this whole, we don't like advertising, we don't like being persuaded, and if I think something is going on, I am going to say that it's not a good product. So we tend to kind of think about what the messaging are. But when they all look the same, like the top ones, even though they're not actually the same, we found that the evaluation in terms of perceptions was really, really different. So with the middle one, they said that must be really unhealthy, for an example, but it also tastes really good, and I would buy it, whilst the others, they wouldn't actually purchase. So we were suggesting at the time, because we like to manipulate people, I don't like the word manipulation, but sometimes you can do some good with it, that if you actually want people to eat healthier, maybe design them to look less healthy, so people have the perception of them being yummier, and therefore they will engage in repeat purchase, which kind of makes sense. I'm still waiting for someone to give that a go. It hasn't seemed to happen yet. Now, this is my favorite creature. He's very pretty. He's a little strange. I have cut off his genitals deliberately because they come out quite big. There are, if you want to Google him, he comes out with those on, but that's not what I'm meant to be talking about. So just not to offend anyone, I've got rid of them. But he is a representation of our brain, or our sensory systems in the brain. And he basically tells you which parts of our sensory systems are the most important. And as you can see, the hands are pretty huge. And the second area that's very influential is the mouth and the lips. So again, that's because you really feel textures. And again, your hands are giving you a chance to actually really get to grips with what something feels like. And if you think about kids, when we're very young, I'm talking sort of below the age of 5 or 6 here, they tend to use their hands to almost explore everything. So again, that gives us an idea that you need to build up this frame of reference for what things feels like, because your brain thinks it's important. And then, of course, whilst you know what things feels like, you don't need to go up and touch everything. Or you might do. I do, I think. But yeah, most normal people may not. So yes, it gives us this insight, just thinking about how humans behave, that touch is very, very important. And what happens in our brain is that we have neural pathways. And these neural pathways are piggybacking on our nervous system. So they run through our entire body all the time, and they send messages to the brain that something is going on in terms of touch. So that no part of our body is excluded, We know if you touch someone on the arm, it will go straight to the brain and so forth. So here's where we're going to play a little game. You don't have to stand up. If you want to, by all means, and try to stand on one leg. This is where I have a bit of fun. And use your index finger and put it on your lip. And then tell me where you feel the sensation. On the lip. Yeah, you feel it on the lip. Now use the same finger and put it on your ankle and tell me where you feel the sensation. The finger, yes. Now, if I just want to add, before I go on, if anybody felt differently, that can happen and it doesn't make you abnormal in any shape or form, okay? So don't fret if that's the case. I'm just not going to go into how that side of things work because we'll be here forever. But yes, most people will feel the lip first, and that's because the distance from our neural paths to travel to the brain is shorter, so they get there quicker, right? Again, the finger is shorter than it actually is from the ankle because it takes longer for the brain to get the signals. So that's perfectly normal, and there's nothing funny about it. But in terms of restaurant designs, we can utilize this, so that's kind of nice. What we can do is this. We can make sure that people eat yummy things, and this is McDonald's, and here comes my standard joke, it's incredibly yummy. And if you don't think it's yummy, that's okay, you don't have to go to McDonald's, but hypothetically, now imagine this is really yummy. So you get the input through your mouth, and of course you will feel, oh, this is great, because that's the signals that's reaching your brain first. The second one's going to be the hands. And you will either, if you happen to be in McDonald's, that is, take the little fluffy bun thing around. You can tell I don't go to McDonald's, but I do know what it looks like. And it comes out of the box, and the buns are actually designed to feel extra soft, so that, again, gives you really nice tactile input for your fingers. Alternatively, they tend to have these kind of crinkly paper, or a lot of fast food restaurants do. And that feels nice to touch again, and it's because you then get secondary information that reinforces that what you're eating is actually nice. So it's just to kind of heighten the awareness of that this is yummy and you want to come back. However, what you don't really want to do in most restaurants is, especially if they're fast food ones, because you're relying on a high turnover, you don't want people to sit there forever. So if you actually make the chair a bit, or seat, less comfortable, it means people will actually want to move on. But because they're focusing more in terms of consciousness on what's coming through their finger and the lips, they're not thinking about the fact that the seat is uncomfortable, but it will still make them move on quicker than they would if they sat there really comfortably. So that also tells you, again, a joke I cracked before, and I'm sorry if you've heard the joke, because I know there's a couple of people in here who probably have. But, you know, if you're not sitting comfortably for the moment, and you're done rating my talk later, we know it's down to the seat, okay? It's not me. So it works very well. We also want to think about touch more widely, and I'm not going to go into this hugely because, again, it doesn't really sit within any of the things we're going to talk about, but just because we have mentioned touch, I think we should also just emphasize that people have a preference for environments where they can touch things. So even if you are thinking about food-related settings and you really can't pick things up, it can lead to frustration. So designing things with hugely tactile elements in them tends to work really well for people. And this could, of course, be, you know, touching cushions on a sofa in a restaurant, but you just want to reinforce this whole let's get engaged and let's get them to touch something. And this brings us on to supermarkets. So supermarkets, of course, are places where we don't usually touch things. So if we want to change those who tend to be more in tune with the tactile sensory system, and some people are, they're usually not aware of that this is the case, but they are, then you need to work on the visual basis, like my example with the biscuits, to try to get that through to people. Unless, of course, you were a bit unusual, and I did see a lady once. It had to be a lady, to my big horror. But I was observing, if you ever see me in the supermarket, by the way, run, because I will be watching. I can't help myself. But she was kind of going like this, with absolutely every single thing on the shelf. So, of course, there are people who do physically interact, but most don't, and they will rely on the visual sensory system. And that's the premise we're going to kind of be working on here. And the reality is that most people will have an average shopping trip to a supermarket that lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. Yes, it can be longer, I appreciate that. It can also be shorter, but this is the average in the UK, okay? Which means that for every product category you're looking at, you have somewhere between sort of 10 and 14 seconds on average. That is nothing. You won't have time to make a reliable decision. It is not possible unless you are superhuman, because your brain can't do it. If you were to stop at every item you buy and really think about the feasibility of that item, you are going to leave the supermarket exhausted and possibly need a rest for 3 weeks, because your brain will be so tired, because there is so much information there. And this is why we tend to just use the superficial cues for when we're shopping. And this is really good news for supermarkets, because they can do all sorts of things to get you to do what they want you to do. And the first thing, of course, is never, ever, ever take a big shopping trolley. Because you will fill it up, because it looks less full all the time compared to the little one. So you will keep filling it up until it's full. We just do that automatically. And that, unfortunately, means you're going to spend twice as much. It's a similar system with the baskets, because having a small basket is much better than going for one of the big ones. If you have the big ones, you're more likely to fill them up, and they take about 60% more than the one on the arm. But the benefit of having one on your arm, from a shopper's point of view, is that you get the physical weight of it. So you are now, remember how important touch is, very much aware of the weight. And that is associated, the heavier it gets, the more costly it is, because that's the association you will have. So you're much less likely, therefore, to buy a lot of things. Now, the problem with that is that we're also very lazy to look for the little baskets, because we sometimes actually have to look for them. Because there are certain supermarkets, I'm not going to tell you which names, because I'm sure you can recognize this if you go there. They will put the baskets underneath the tills, so when you come through, there will be lots of shopping trolleys, very big ones. Usually you have to go a little bit further for the smaller ones as well. And then the little baskets will be hidden under the tills. And for you then, when you come rushing through, and you will have the big baskets just on the inside, that's fine. You're not going to want to run off to the tills on the other side to get a basket, to come back, to start from the beginning again, because it's a lot of work. We don't do that in a supermarket. So instead, if you want a basket, they will take the big basket, and you are going to fill it up and spend 60% more in terms of money, or maybe not in money, but you will buy 60% more. So they're very good at making you kind of do what they want you to. And then, of course, we have the layout. The layout is beautiful. There are variations, of course, but the average layout looks sort of like this. So you will start off here, of course. You will go in through the fruit and vegetables and flowers that generates this nice perception of freshness, which is great. So you then think everything in there is going to be fresh, unless you go through some supermarkets where you think, oh my goodness, the vegetables are dying. But that's kind of the impression they want you to get. Not that they're dying, but the freshness. And then, because you have the aisle system, you need to walk around them to see everything in the shop until you get to the tills. Cutting through is not an option, because they're blocking you. So of course you could maybe go from aisle 1 to aisle 3 if you really want to, but usually people go up and down. You know, it's a bit like being trapped in IKEA. Sorry, I don't mean trapped. Being inside a beautiful shopping experience of IKEA. So that is what they want you to do, because the more time you spend in there, the more likely you are to just grab things along the way without thinking about it. And of course, the more you're likely to pick up the special offers that are at the end of the aisles. Now, remarkably, things that go at the end of the aisle tend to sell about 50% better than anything else. And that's because when you're coming around the corner, you will see what's on the end of the aisle. And the more you see something, the more likely you are to pick it up, because it's very much a visual game. Whatever captures your attention is increasing the likelihood of you purchasing it with something like 75%. So if you walk in blindly and go like this, you will come out not buying very much. That would be my advice. But of course, if the end of the aisle looks like this, which it might do, you might recognize this place. Special offers, it's this, remember now, price, value. We're getting excited. The brain is activating the pleasure part of our brain, and that means we really want them. So if you see this at every turn, you are guaranteed to pick up a lot of bargains that you probably didn't really want to need, but you're leaving with them either way. So that brings us on to e-retail, internet shopping for those who are more normal. I think e-retail is a word I'm never going to get my head around, but nevertheless, that's what we're talking about. Now, here's the thing. And I actually think this is fascinating, because very few people who buy something in a physical shop actually returns it compared to those who buy something online. And there are, in the UK, clothing industries that goes under because of the high amount of return rates. There are clothing outlets that actually have return rates as high as 80% in the UK. Apart from the cost implications, it's also not sustainable for many reasons, and that's a different talk, but it is actually quite interesting. So this sort of tells us that people aren't very happy with what they're buying online, because if they were, it wouldn't actually go back. And still, the high street is dying, of course. People don't go to physical shops anymore. But can you imagine, every time you go shopping, if you went to a physical shop, how it would increase the likelihood of you being happy with what you bought? And maybe save you the kerfuffle of sending it back and repackaging and whatever else you need to do. But people don't think like that, unfortunately. So the reasons why people shop online are very blatantly obvious, of course. You know, it's efficient. You can do it in the middle of the night, which appeals to me because that means if I can't be bothered during daytime when I'm working, I can finally get something sorted. You know, it's midnight, and I will also make a very bad decision because I'm tired and it'll probably be sent back, but that's beside the point. We are also particularly prone to the fact that we can compare prices. So again, here's our pleasure part of the brain, thinking we can get bargains, we can compare. If we go to the physical shop around the corner, we can't do that because there's no comparison, and that's a problem. It shouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem for us. And then, of course, why shouldn't we shop? Well, what is really remarkable is a very high amount of the British population still say, I don't really trust the internet. It's a bit of an issue. Why should I, know that what they're saying is true? And the trust issue is a huge obstacle, and that's also one of the reasons why people sometimes send things back. Because even though it comes to you, you're thinking, did I really get the best value here? Were they kind of conning me? Should I be worried? Was the price fair? And you start doubting all those pieces of information that you came across. But usually the biggest obstacle is to actually, am I going to use this website? So if you're setting up a new retailing business, it's very hard to get consumers to trust you. So trust is a real, genuine issue. And what's really interesting is what people then often go to when they don't trust the website or even sure about purchasing a particular product is they'll go, I'm going to read the reviews. Excellent idea, because I know if other people say so, it's got to be true, right? Not really. Because the reality is that 90% of all the online shoppers don't ever, ever, ever leave any feedback of any shape or form on any kind of official website. Then you have 10%, of which 9% will occasionally, I mean, maybe once a month, once every 3 months, or maybe even twice a year, give some sort of feedback on some websites. And that means it's 1% of all of those users that actually are giving feedback. That kind of gives you an idea of how skewed the information is. So you can't actually trust reviews in any shape or form because it's just those who, for whatever reason, have nothing better to do than giving feedback that's giving feedback. And gosh forbid, and this is also very dangerous for those setting up new businesses, that someone decided they didn't like you. Because if we have negative information on our mind, we are about 75% more likely to actually put a review on there, because negative information really bugs us. So we have a natural need to get that out there, because it's almost like vengeance. I hated this company, I'm going to get them. So you will write something really bad. And then, of course, someone will read that and go, oh, we're not going to use them. And that might be the end of that business, even though it probably wasn't a particular issue for all the other 500-600 people who didn't give reviews. But you don't know that because it's not on there. So what do we do then? So if you are worried about the trust, you can't read the reviews, maybe you want to set up an online business, or you are looking for some sort of signs of, should I shop on this or not? Is this reliable? Well, we talk a lot about psychological distance here. And what tends to happen is that we want things that are familiar, because then it feels closer to us somehow. So if they're selling well-known brands, even though the website might be super dodgy potentially, that gives us this feeling of, oh, it's familiar, it's okay, I can buy this. It's not that bad. You're not going to question the fact that the price is, a little bit out of sync with the rest of the world, because that just excites your brain. So your pleasure part of the brain's going, yay! And you're thinking, yeah, and I'm familiar with the brand, I'll buy that. That could actually be to your detriment, of course. So you need to be careful with that, because it's not necessarily a good sign. So what we can do then, potentially, is we can provide a hybrid model, and that's something that consumers trust more. So if you can see that actually this website also has a physical shop in the center of Cambridge, you're thinking, if something goes wrong, I could actually go and see them because I know they exist, they're real. They're not just some crazy company online that will dodge me and, shipping something from a country I never heard of, and the items after they've taken my money may not arrive, or however you perceive it. So that really works well, and we tend to really favor those. But of course, not every business can afford to have a physical shop anymore because it's so expensive. It's just not feasible. So what do? Well, you put a nice family picture. And we think, because it's a nice looking person, it's a real human, or we think, we have no idea who put the picture up, but we see the person on there and we go, oh, but that's really nice, it's family run. And sometimes it's even enough to say a family run business and people think, oh, that's okay. But actually, it doesn't make it better in any shape or form. How do we know? They A, exist, and B, that they're reliable. We don't. It's just all in our mind. But if you are setting up a business online, stick a pretty picture of a family on, and it works really well. Another thing we can do, of course, if we have the hybrid business, it's super simple, because we could then just put, the actual picture of our offices up, and that's okay. But if we don't have something that you can visit, we should actually still put a picture of a building, because people then, again incorrectly, it's a bit like the family, there could be absolutely a picture of anybody, think there is a physical site somewhere where you can go. Of course, the picture could be of any random building, it doesn't matter, that's still how we're going to perceive it. That is actually me done. I hope you found it interesting. So if we want to spend the next 10 or so minutes for a chat or some questions, or I'm very happy to do that. If you think this was utterly boring, please feel free to go. I won't judge, a little bit, but not very much so. But no, do we have any questions? Oh, thank you. Oh, I feel happy you haven't all left. That's very good. Do we have any questions? Oh, we do. Oh, okay.
Okay, Catherine, we've got 2 questions from online watchers, viewers, so thank you so much for the questions. First question is, to what extent are the supermarket queues defeated if you go in with a shopping list and stick to it?
That is a brilliant question, because that is usually when people say to me, what do I do not to fall for all the tricks in a supermarket? That's what you do. So you actually have to take out your anal personality. I don't have one, but I do it all the time. And basically, you write a shopping list and you go, I'm buying this. And even better is you put the price you are prepared to pay next to it. So if you know, you're buying flowers, something really boring, and the Savers kind of brand that, you know, costs 60p isn't there, and you've written 60p on your list, walk off. Buy the flower the next time, whether you need it or not. That way you will really stick to your budget. So it actually works really, really well. Was there a second one?
Yes, second question. To what extent and with what impact is Amazon's new shopping experience shaping consumer behaviour?
Oh, well, I need to be very careful here, I think. Does anybody work for Amazon? You're not going to admit that now, are you? Even if you do, because I know we have a Cambridge office and I don't want to upset anyone. It is shaping the experience quite a lot. Unfortunately, maybe not in the best direction, because we have found that consumers that are happy to engage with Amazon experience are also very happy to compromise on a lot of quality. So the expectation often seems to be that if you purchase something, it doesn't have to be 100% okay. It can be a bit of a knockoff or a bit cheaper, and you kind of accept that because of the convenience. So you're offsetting the convenience perhaps with the actual product. But it also makes us have unrealistic expectations on other companies, which is a problem, because we know Amazon can deliver, I don't know, next day or 3 days, depending on what we're ordering. So we expect everybody to do that. And when other people don't do it, we kind of feel like they don't provide a good service. So again, a smaller business will always struggle in comparison because they just can't keep up that kind of structure. I mean, it's just, if you're a 2-man band that's working out of a basement, you're not going to be able to deliver it the following day. That's just the way it is. So it has helped shape. There's a lot more to it than that, but a lot of it is actually quite negative, and I don't want to be too negative, so let's move on, I think. Yes.
Thanks, it was a really good talk. I was wondering, would you say that some marketing strategies are just used and abused and have been known for so long now? Is there any research to suggest that people are actually seeing past it? Because seeing special offer everywhere, and actually every day now, whereas it used to be every few weeks perhaps, or last hotel booking available, you most expect to see it, and so it doesn't really work anymore? Or is it just by seeing it all the time, after a while, you just succumb to it?
So I would love to say that it doesn't work, but unfortunately we know it does work. It works very well because of what I started off talking about is that we're not conscious consumers. A lot of what we do without thinking about it. And it's very difficult to get consumers to go in with their eyes wide open and sort of say, right, I'm really going to think about this, because it's exhausting in any setting. And you have a lot of other things going on. And that's also why it's so dangerous to shop on your phone. So people tend to spend a lot more when they're shopping on their phone because they're distracted by the noises around them. Someone's talking to them, you know, this like this, and goes, yeah, I'll just click on that. And again, all the messages that are kind of, you know, last one, again, you have less time to think about it. And the more you limit the time you're thinking about it, the more you're likely to fall prey for it. So it doesn't work just because you're not thinking about it. If you did, you can combat all of these things. That's not an issue. But you have to really be aware of it and think about it. And people don't. Yes.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It seems to me there's a huge overlap between what you've been talking about and behavioural economics and health behaviour prompts as well. And I'm interested in how we could bring those together, particularly in relation to things like healthy eating. I wonder if you've got some comments on that.
Well, my first comments would be, I don't believe in behavioral economics because it's just a way of shoving psychology together with economics. So that's no different from what I spoke about, because we use a lot of economic models and things if suitable, but we test them in real life. Healthy eating is incredibly complex because people have such different reasons for wanting to do it. And I have worked quite a lot with food waste. And what we find is that people who are more health conscious are also more conscious about things like food waste. So often there's a parallel between things and interests that makes people more kind of receptive to certain messages. Unfortunately, one of the big factors, which now more than ever, we actually had a dip in that for a while, is the fact that people are short of money. And even if, and people keep saying this, you know, vegetables don't necessarily cost more than going to McDonald's, that's not the perception people have. And the perception in itself is really difficult to combat. And then if you don't have the money and you think vegetables are expensive, why are you going to buy them? You're not. That's just the way it is. So rather than kind of doing what the government's currently doing, which is incredibly fragmented in my opinion, and they come from all sorts of directions and they need to have more of a cohesive strategy and stop dictating to people and try to use marketing techniques to lift the interests in things. So a really nice example, shifting the rubbish kids drink. Are the children here? We need to be careful. You know, they tend to like the soft drinks and all the sugary stuff, which is really bad. So I loved, have you heard of Air Up, the water bottle? No, silence, most people. Well, some people are nodding. So Air Up was effectively, or was still, because it's out there, it's a water bottle, just a plain, boring water bottle. But then it has a scented strip around the bit where you drink from. And because our olfactory system and our taste system are so intertwined, if you smell something strongly, you think that's what you're tasting, even though it's not. So what they basically experiencing, the kids, is that they're drinking water, but it smells like Coke, therefore they think they're drinking Coke, but they're actually drinking water. You know, it's a bit like my biscuit example. Make them look unhealthy and get them to eat something that's sensible. But we're not capitalizing on those kind of techniques, and there's no reason why we couldn't. Part of it, of course, is taxes for the government. It's a bit like smoking. You know, it's been a very slow process to get to where we are today because it's generating a high level of income for the country. And it's the same thing with high sugar contents. It's very taxable, it's very profitable, so we don't want to get rid of it altogether. So all those kind of things are an issue, but if the government really wanted to do something, they would say, right, let's get creative and look at what can we do to change people's behavior in an interesting way, like the water bottle or the biscuits, and then we would see a change. But this has to be followed through with things like, it's not super expensive, you know, don't make the water bottle. Air Up was 30 quid, I believe, the cheapest version, which is ridiculous. And there's no reason why it's so expensive. It's just a fashion item, effectively, but, you know, still very clever. But if you could get those kind of things to then fall in price, people who don't have a lot of money could utilize those sort of things, and we could combat a lot of, like, children's obesity problems and so forth. And then it's also often about choice. You give people too much choice, and choice is a huge issue, especially for young people. We know generally, even just from a shopping scenario, if you're out shopping and you have more than 5 or 6 options, you often will walk away because it requires a lot of cognitive input and you just don't want to think about it. But if you give them 1 or 2 options, you're more likely to actually make a choice. So think about schools, think about nurseries, you know, don't give kids 5 options or wherever it has been in my kids' school and it's all been rubbish, because they will make the wrong choice on the basis often they have to make an option, make a choice, but the option will probably be the worst one just because that's what they're most familiar with and kids think is cool. So if you're giving them two healthy options, you know, they're going to be able to do the right thing. So society needs to look at it more broadly rather than going, oh, let's tax this sugar here and let's talk to people, because education doesn't work. We know that. It's not that simple. There's lots of obstacles in people's lives, and most people know. They're not stupid. Everybody knows we shouldn't be obese. It's not good for us, but we're still doing it. So we need to do other things to kind of combat that, yeah.
How do these principles apply to services that are intangible? Have you got any insights on things that are different or specific to services as opposed to tangible products that you've given some very great insights on?
You mean whether or not they have a physical structure around them? Yes, Auto Trader is quite an interesting example because, of course, are we familiar with Auto Trader, the car company? Yeah. So they have online businesses only, and they also have the hybrid models, and they find that services coming from, in terms of maintenance and selling and all those kind of things from hybrid models, tend to be far more valued by consumers than those that are just online where you click and go, right, I can buy this car and it will somehow miraculously appear on my door. I'm trying to think of if there's any other obvious examples. I can't on the top of my head for the moment, but hybrids always work better than something that is just a pure online. It doesn't matter whether it's a product or a service, it's pretty consistent. And one of the reasons, again, why people, even though there seems to be a bit of a Marmite effect with something like Amazon, like they love or hate them depending on their experiences, people have usually seen the store and warehouses and things, you know, where, so they know there is something physical to it. It's not just, oh, here's an online. So once people kind of know that, they tend to like them more. I mean, Ocado is another one of those examples, which of course has done incredibly well. But then again, once you have someone who's physically delivering, that also helps people because they then feel like, oh, look, it's an Ocado truck. There's something tangible there that they can kind of latch onto. It's not, even though the actual physical website is just online, they don't mind that as much because there's someone coming to their door and they dressed, I think, in an Ocado shirt or something. I can't remember now. So again, that kind of helps. So anything where you try to have something that's more personal will kind of reinforce the idea of trust and success for a company.
Thank you very much.
In terms of supermarkets, you were talking very specifically about products. Is there anything that you can say about aisles, the width of the space, the height of the ceilings, and things like that? Slightly more physical distribution, lighting, for example? Yeah. Or flashing lights behind the till?
So the width is very important of the aisles. The smaller they are, the less expensive they usually perceived. The wider they are, the more luxurious people associate the items to be. This also is very much linked to the physical proximity to others, because if someone bumps you, that tends to have a very negative perception on the people shopping, because we don't like being touched by strangers. If you're very tactile, it could be so much so that you actually leave the shop if you're unfortunate, as the retailer would be unfortunate. So that's very important. Things like lighting, yes, it can be an issue because, again, if it's a very sharp lighting, like here, for an example, products tend to look a little bit less colorful, and people think if they look a bit washed out, that's a sign of that they're cheaper and not, you know, particularly perhaps well manufactured. So yes, there's a lot of different things in terms of design, and something that's quite interesting, I think, and again, my post students have heard me talk a lot about it just because I love it, is the new M&S stores in London. I don't know if anybody's seen how they redesigned them, but the food section in particular is very nice. They kind of made it look a bit like an old marketplace. So they have wicker baskets and things there, and they're kind of giving the association that this is traditional. Because again, we know that if you go back to things that people associate, like a food hall or something, with quality, and also an element of tradition, because in this country we like tradition. It's quite important to a lot of consumers. You tend to be prepared to pay more for it. So they've actually done a really, really nice job of that. But it also comes down to another thing they've done in the ladies' clothing department is they have a lot of rounded contours. Women have a preference for rounded contours. They don't know that they do, but they do. So that makes them feel happier when they're shopping. I mean, it has nothing to do with the clothes or whatever. It's just purely an environmental thing where they think, oh, this is nice, you know, I'm feeling happy here. So yes, there's lots of things you can do in terms of physical layout to change how people view the environment. And, you know, again, you could throw in some music. And if you want to sell more Italian wine, play Italian music. That works really, really well. There's an endless amount, basically. I mean, there's a whole research area on its own just on the physical components of different types of shopping places. Right, I think we now are up against time. So thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure.